Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have two challenges. One is to summarize an extremely rich discussion and final panelist. And the other challenge is I'm sitting between you and the reception, and I know that the energy level is going down. So please bear with me, and I'd like to bring you back here because some of you already checked out, thinking of what's happening at the mayor's reception. Let me acknowledge first the soils year. This year is the soils year, and let me acknowledge the fact that at the core of the Nexus discussion that we've heard today, and at the course of the Nexus in general, is the soil, which for many, many, many years has been neglected. So I'm really glad to see that the organization of this conference have acknowledged that and brought it up as an acknowledgement, and also to the UN process that acknowledged soil as the year of the soil. So I'm really pleased to see that. And I'd like also to thank the organizing committee and UNU-FLORES for putting together an extremely needed Nexus discussion, because the science I saw today and the science I read over the last several weeks has been really promising and extremely important, and a benchmark in the Nexus discussion. There has been many, many benchmarks in the Nexus dialogue for the last 8-9 years since, and actually around, I wouldn't say the starting point, but the starting point was in Bonn, not too far from here, but this conference is another benchmark in the science of the Nexus that I hope that will carry forward. What I intend to do is to try to summarize at least the high points, and I apologize ahead of time if some of main ideas are missed, but I do hope that some of the major points have been touched upon, and I'd like to interject some of my own thoughts into these slides, and I gave in the slides proper acknowledgement where it is due, and will conclude with some highlights that I really felt that the panel that we just saw extremely important, highlighting a lot of issues that I missed during the discussion for the day. So thanks for all who contributed to the discussion all throughout the day. As a matter of just briefing what are being projected in the climate change, we saw this on and off during the day. But in summary, the dry will get drier and the wet will get wetter. That's the bottom line of the climate change when it comes to water. And if you see the river flow, there is a lot of correlation. I would say even one-to-one correlation. I haven't done the statistics, but you could see visually very high correlation between river flow and soil moisture. What that tells me is that water security and food security are in jeopardy as we move forward. Yes, we know that the river flow and surface flow does affect the surface soil moisture, and the vadose zone hydrology is very much a backbone to food security. 60% of the food we eat is generated from dry land, and it will be significantly impacted by this trend. And a lot of even though we pump groundwater, but a lot of our water supply for fresh water comes in from surface water. So the water security is going to be in jeopardy as we move forward. One slide focusing on on some of we've seen a significant discussion this morning from a keynote speaker on the meteorological society. This is focusing on one country, Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is expected to have 1.5 meters sea rise level. The significance of this cannot be accounted for. One, the major rice production is along the sea, so about 16%, probably more, of the rice production will be impacted because they will be under flooding. Second is the salinity. Soil salinity would be hugely impacted by that, and that cannot be overlooked. This is just one snapshot of the impact that we see as a result of sea level rise in one individual country. And you could look into this projected to other locations. I'd like to highlight some of the other projected consequences of climate change, starting with, yes, we've seen in previous presentation that is expected to have more intense, frequent, and longer heat waves. There hasn't been significant discussions today on energy, but the climate change impact on energy use is huge in terms of maintaining our building. If you look at globally, about 40% of our energy goes into maintaining these buildings. This building here that we speak of, many of the buildings we live in are not in LEED certification. So when it comes to energy and climate change, that has not been highlighted enough, I believe, but there is a lot of additional energy demand. It's projected 40% energy demand will be increased due to climate change. And we don't have the infrastructure, let alone the resources. So resources is one, but the infrastructure to support this increase is certainly not there. We do have a decrease in subtropic precipitation, increase in precipitation intensity with longer periods between rain events. What does that mean? Is that there is certainly a highlight between flooding as well as drought, which is very significant. Drying of mid-continent in summer and greater drought risk, increase in hurricane, peak, wind intensities, and number of most intense. We're expected also to have increase in wind intensity and in the number of most intense storms. Many of these countries that we see today are in the MENA region, would experience extensive amount of sandstorms that impact a lot of the infrastructure, that impacts a lot of what is known in terms of the indoor and not, I wouldn't say only indoor, but the urban style we know. What does it mean to agriculture? It means that greater crop water need because of higher evapotranspiration. It means that there's also, beside agriculture, it's expected that we have greater water needs for cities, freshwater supplies. We have, as seen in earlier slide, we have less fresh water in many, many places. I say places here, but the compounding effect of climate change is that a lot of this change happens in areas where already experiencing more population growth. If you look at the population growth, demographics, it's not happening in Europe, it's not happening in OECD countries. It's happening in areas where you're expecting additional water stresses to the system. So that's a compounding effect. We're going to see more water and infrequent event. That's the kind of the flood drought syndrome that you see. So you're going to see in the same places a lot of droughts, a lot of floods. More pests and diseases because of the climatic effect. Are we going to see less crop cover, which impacts surface erosion? That's impact the topsoil, which is the fertile soil that is responsible for crop production. And I say here crop, I don't say plant, because we really, there's a difference. And I meant to say crop because this is the arable or the edible plant side that we see. And it's in fact going to be in jeopardy. There was some discussion earlier about the northward crop migration or the southern crop migration. So there's going to be migration shifting in ecozones the way we know it. The danger is that we're expecting to increase productivity in areas we don't even understand the history. So farmers, again, most of the food we eat is produced in dryland areas by rain-fed, where there is a history of knowing the growing season and the growing pattern and the growing system. Now we're changing, we're shifting. So we're going to grow wheat in areas that has never grown wheat before. So there isn't a history of knowledge of that cropping system. And diminished water quality, which is extremely important, and not to say the least, higher energy prices. So all of these are going to be experienced. And now this is a snapshot of the food prices projections with and without climate change. And you could see the difference in terms of the, yes, there is a baseline price increase in various stable food around the world, but with climate change, that price hike is going to be tremendously increased. This slide is very significant. We talked about a lot throughout the day about waste. We talked a lot about how do we reduce that waste. But before we understand the makeup of the waste, it's very difficult to really make any significant contribution to how do we reduce that waste. The significance of this, if you look at OECD countries, a lot of the waste is happening in homes. And if you look at developing countries, a lot of this waste is happening outside home. It's happening in the transport and in the processing. So if we want to make an impact on the waste, we need to understand where that waste is happening. And I think that's very, very significant. Let me borrow a slide from Professor Lal where he really outlined the nexus. So there has been a lot of discussions about what is the nexus and what are we looking at. And I think Professor Lal identified the nexus for us, at least in the context of this audience, as the soil, water, energy nexus within a climate change and food security context. So there's a lot of externalities to the system. Yes, there has been discussion about what nexus we're talking about, simplification versus complexity. I think the beauty about the nexus discussion is to simplify the processes within a context of a much larger context. I would move forward without quantification of the nexus processes. The nexus would remain to be a conceptual. And there is, again, there is a, what I see is not all of the citations have been here, but anyway, I apologize for that. Somehow the citations did not make it to this version. This is one of the authors of one of the white papers outlined a systems thinking of the nexus moving forward. The elements of that includes, so what is the systems thinking and how can it be used to move the nexus moving forward? Some of these elements include mapping of the nexus processes, which was articulated well this morning, quantification, identification of critical linkages, and identification of policy actions. Those are, and then again, this is at the scale in which the nexus is being projected. The lessons learned in this system theory is that the rebound effect, which we've seen in the keynote speaker this morning, this is very, very important, because when we talk about fixing one issue, you don't want to have that rebound effect. And the rebound effect could be due to behavioral changes where people realize that they need to shift their action, or it could be due to the definition of the nexus. So if you're not defining the nexus broadly, you're going to see these rebounding effect. Second, and which is not least important, that the systems thinking help us with critical challenges in the nexus and help policy aid and better understanding of these linkages. So there's a big role that the systems theory, because if we look at the nexus has been with us as a current concept for the last, I would say, 8 years. The systems science has been with us for the last 30 years. So there's a lot of knowledge transfer and a lot of information that we can build on in the nexus that from what have happened in the discussion with or the improvement in the systems theory. In terms of climate change impact and adaptation, water and land, in the water and land context, there is two issues here that I'd like to highlight, is that the importance of the governance. The governance is very important within a climate change adaptation because of the complexity of the system, so the governance becomes more important. Second, but not least important, is the diversity of experiences from various sectors and the regional. So these are two important elements that cannot be ignored. That's the scale of which, so there was discussion in the panel about at what scale, how do we bring that down to the local level. It's important to include in the nexus discussion across scale sectors, from the local all the way to the policymaker, as well as have a consistent governance structure. So in terms of the gaps, it has been identified that we've got data information gaps, which was highlighted prominently in the panel's discussion at the end. Impact gap. we don't understand the impact that's going to happen, especially at the local level. Scaling and modeling gaps. We do have a scaling and modeling gaps that has been identified by several, including the final panel, and understanding there's an inadequate, in terms of the uncertainty and the quantitative projections of changes in water, both green and blue cycles, and the effect on water management. Moving into adapting to climate change and the role of science data in responding to the opportunities and challenges in the water-soil nexus. We have data needs that constitute of water data in terms of precipitation extremes, soil, runoff, and other snow and other water equivalent groundwater, soils data, again, soil moisture, soil profile, porosity, and other water waste data in terms of waste production, irrigation. This area is going to become very, very critical, especially for bridging the water gap that we have, which we'll come back to this later. In terms of the required data for the nexus, it needs to be updated, it needs to be modernized. We need to move into new data sets, new portals that allow us not only to have data, but to have shared data, as was highlighted by many of the speakers. The adequacy and the sustainability of this data need to be reviewed in the context of climate change. A lot of the data we have is stationary data. And the challenges we have lying ahead of us is that the uncertainty of the data, especially in the hydrology, we're moving into an uncertainty era where the past does not predict the future. Climate change, profligacy, poverty, and destruction. Professor Moss has outlined to us that the climate change is not an isolated problem, from a profligacy of enriched society, poverty in developing countries, and the destruction everywhere. He outlined 3 immediate steps that needs to be taken and are possible to be taken. One is the curbing the emission and increasing the natural carbon storing ecosystem. Second, it has been highlighted, this second point has been highlighted prominently in the panel discussion, to replace the GDP by an index that takes into account the human cost to natural resources depletion. Last but not least is to reform the taxation. We've talked about it in terms of the policy, in terms of the pricing. That pricing and that taxation needs to have the true cost of the damage that has taken by kind of the virtual damage that's been taken care of by overexploitation of these resources. As we all know, for example, water, we don't pay for water. Water is free. We only pay for the services that surrounds the water. So Professor Moss is calling for revision of that and increasing, or at least reassessment of the taxation and cost recovery processes. Moving into the various sessions, and I'll highlight each slide, some of the high-level points from each of the sessions, starting with the first session, the Nexus approach in light of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. I know we've heard extensively from the panelists. These are some maybe complementary comments to what we've heard. With the limited agricultural land, we need models to explore intensification options and trade-offs with water use. Agriculture intensification, we have heard much about it over the last couple of years. I personally, this is not the committees or the session, my personal view is that we need to redefine agriculture intensification. If agriculture intensification means that we need to produce more, irrespective of the water use and energy use, I think this is the wrong approach of looking at intensification. We need to redefine what does intensification means in the context of a nexus. And I think it's very, very important. So what I personally would add, that it's not only water use, but also energy use, because we cannot ignore the nexus framework when we talked about intensification. So this is very, very important. I do understand that we may not have the luxury of expanding land. So we need to use the current land resource we have, but it cannot be on the cost of water, energy use. Yes, we need to increase efficiency. And I have a problem personally with the word efficiency, because as been highlighted by many of the speakers today, that increasing efficiency does not necessarily give you gain on reducing water use, for example. So we need to be looking at the right metrics to measure sustainability. Building partnerships. I was very happy to see many of the sessions. There are very, very kind of social elements, human factors that are integrated in this discussion. That's not only about technology, it's not only about the science, but there's also about the human factors. So there's a communication, there's a bridging that gap, it's taking that nexus discussion down to the human level. So building partnerships through projects that are community-driven is important to the sustainability of natural resources management. We also need to optimize land management. It has a potential to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus input into the reservoir by approximately 25%. Yes, this is a limited study, but I think it has the potential to be expanded. Last but not least, that we have a policy also implication through proactive cross-sectoral interaction that needs to go into quantitative assessment. I believe that this policy element here resonates with a lot of the discussion that we have here also in the concluding panel. Session 2 outlined that there is a lack of understanding of the organization that fit the current state of adaptation. I think this is very, very important insight that, again, how do we take this SDG down to the local level? We need to better understand how the local organizations work and how you can really promote the sustainability issues down. We cannot import knowledge from the outside. The knowledge has to be relevant to the local communities. River basin organization can make a huge difference and can contribute to adaptation in an international river basin. This is also resonates with the fact that community-based activities are very, very important. And again, science communication does have the measurable effect on people, adaptability to climate change, and has potential to make people greater willingness to take action to adapt climate change impact. Moving into session 4, inclusiveness of sustainable industrial development for resource-efficient industries. We've talked about one example from the Mediterranean countries. The role of engaging the industry can have a significant impact on the resource efficiency. Again and again, going back to the local level, demonstrations are key to convince local industry about engaging with sound business strategies. I think the awareness is, I believe, in many developing countries of the role of the business sector in promoting sustainability is not there. So that needs to be promoted and need to enlarge the base of national service providers to cover future needs for sustainable production services. Session 5, sustainable energy solution under conditions of climate change. And again, before I go into the summary, my personal opinion that the energy sector is the one, I believe, that will have to carry forward that Nexus discussion. Yes, the Nexus has started or have been incubated within the water community, but I think to create leverage in the future, we must engage the energy sector, and I'm glad that the energy sector has realized. So both the World Energy Council and the International Energy Agency have actually, if you haven't looked at their recent activity, they have started a Nexus platform to look into the water use, mainly the water use in their energy industry, knowing and realizing that water is the critical factor to the energy sector. So they're really realizing that, and I think we need to really emphasize this issue. So the heavy reliance on, again, to session 5, summary, heavy reliance on hydroelectric power may increase the risk of vulnerability of drought, which is we need to look at, of water shortages. So the county needs to diversify the electricity production. Again, technological and efficiency innovation are key for reducing the risk of drought and enhancing energy efficiency in that sector. Again, the last point, which was highlighted by the panel, is the role of how does renewable can be interfaced with the base load This is very, very important. I believe this is one of the nexus points that we can raise loud and clear, that how do we integrate renewable and have higher renewable penetration in the current structure of the energy security. I'd like to shift gears, and I'd like to highlight few points that I believe worth looking at. And one is we've talked about how do we bring resilience. And resilience is about the most at-risk community. And those are the areas that we all know are in dry areas of this world. So I'd like to call for localizing water and food security. What does localizing water and food security mean? It doesn't mean that we do not need to import or we do not need to rely on trade. But it means that to maximize local water and food security in the following sense. One is green water use. At the moment, we don't have a good accounting for green water. So green water accounting is very, very important to start the process. And to remind all of us, 60% of the food we eat is coming from green water, is rain-fed agriculture. We need the better mapping and management of that green water, and we need multi-scale modeling. I'll come back to the multi-scale modeling in a moment because it's very, very important. And let me maybe highlight one point, that academic doesn't necessarily mean evil. Academic means the foundation of what will become a accessible knowledge. And I think this, having policymakers among us, it's important to make that distinction. Because before we can simplify, we need to understand. And in the understanding process, complexity arises. So once we close that loop on the complexity, we can simplify. But I believe that it's very important not to simplify very early in the stage. And as we learn about the nexus and the gap and the knowledge gap, I believe it's very, very critical not to rush into simplification. I think we need to understand, we need to really simplify only after we understand where the simplification can be made. The other element to the localization of water and food security, I'd like to highlight the new water. That's the water that's unaccounted for. This is the gray, the brackish, the waste. There's a lot of knowledge gap in our understanding for what is its potential and what's its impact in terms of risk, on soil quality, and I will not highlight the trade because it's already there. I will not highlight the conservation efficiency and the policy and the genetics. But the green water and the new water are areas that are local that I think that needs and deserves some of our attention. So this is the first call that I'd like to make. In order for us to better utilize green water and better utilize that new water, I call for two different, or at least two areas of gaps that must be needed. The first one is looking at, for the last 50, 60 years, I'm a hydrologist. I've graduated and become a nexus because I do believe in that integration, in that multidisciplinarity. But the hydrology word, this is maybe a complex slide to really pinpoint, but let me highlight the lack of integration between this plane here, which is so this is the soil morphology. If you think of it from a human perspective, this is our DNA. That's what we was born with. This is the soil as we know it as a morphology. And this plane is the evolution. This is how management is impacting that morphology. So this plane that between axes 1 and 2 is the pedology plane. That's the soil plane. We know this plane very, very well. When we come to modeling, we move into this plane, which is the functionality. Unfortunately, because of our rushing into simplification, we end up developing models that are not based on that pedology. So what we need, what I'm calling for, is a better integration. And I'm not saying more complexity. All what I'm calling for, an integration between our functionality axes and the pedology so that we can develop better models that allow us to scale up. At the moment, this is a huge gap in our knowledge of how do the hydrology science and water science can be integrated into whether climate change, whether better understanding of the soil water processes, and Now, before we scale, we need to have the foundation, and I believe this is the foundation. So let me identify 3 research gaps. One is the organization of that physical medium needs to be well understood. Second is that we need to understand a soil structure and its evolution based on physically measured parameters. Those are many of the parameters that we use, especially at multiple scale, are not physically based. Last but not least, we need a rigorous scaling methodologies that is not based on grid master map of a GIS or based on somebody sitting in way disconnected from the pedology to make a convenient mathematical model to develop a scaling. That scaling needs to be based on the organization and natural organization of the soil and soil processes. So we have a nexus, and by definition, nexus has elements. And yes, of course, we've got the food, water, energy nexus, but the elements of the nexus are, I identify them, interlinkages that are quantifiable, and hotspots, which is very, very important. There was a question, and I believe Professor Bogardi asked the question, what is more important? I think if I'm sitting in Texas, what's important there for me in Texas is different than what's important for me in Dresden. In Texas, the hotspot is the fracking, booming industry, and how can we supply water that's not competing for food production to the energy sector. So the hotspot is very important, but we only know that through the interlinkages and developing these interlinkages in a quantitative way. Last but not least is the trade-off. I'm glad that we have a policymaker, at least one among us, because the scientific community is able only to develop these 3. We're only able to give you interlinkages, hotspot, and trade-off. We're not able to provide the impact on the ground. The impact on the ground happens when policymakers sit down and assess and discuss with a dialogue these trade-offs so that they can move on a more science-based decisions. And I think that's a very critical process. So in the nexus, I think we kind of block our mind that our job is only to do the quantification. I believe that's not sufficient. We need to cross that bridge and move into the trade-offs, discussion and the dialogue that take us from a red zone of conflict into a green or blue zone of cooperation. That's where really the impact of the nexus, and I think that's where we need to be focusing. So it's half the story if we only look into the analytics. We need to move beyond the analytics and move into the zone of the dialogue, where we, the scientists, be the honest broker in that dialogue. This is a platform we've been working with. I invite you all to visit. It's the Water, Energy, Food Nexus platform, and it's supposed to be a neutral, but of course nobody is neutral. We all are biased and we bring our baggage into what we do, but at least we tried. Let me, before moving on, I'd like to end with a concluding remark, and I tried to capture the rich discussion that happened over the last 13 hours or 11 hours. Because I know here in Dresden, UNU-FLORES doesn't believe in 8-hour shift. We have 10-hour shift. So concluding remark. We all realize that climate change impact on water, energy, and food security are significant. Adaptation measures need to be bold, and new paradigms are needed. I think we need to have bold, new paradigms on the table. The current paradigm will not allow us to move forward. Whether those new paradigms, scientific paradigms, or policy paradigms, we need to be bold and need to look at this as a challenge. If it's easy, it would have been done. So it needs to be looked at in a very kind of fresh eyes and fresh, and we need to be brave about moving forward. Nexus approaches should be based on holistic system theory. That is, it is needed to identify hotspots in the nexus. So there's no one sector dominates sustainability. If you are in Ethiopia or in Egypt, your nexus hotspot is different than somebody sitting in Dresden or in Texas. However, the nexus platform is a useful tool to identify those hotspots and to identify a way forward. We've heard the decoupling economic growth from resource consumption. I looked at this in a very positive way. I do understand and I appreciate the question that was raised, that we need to continue looking at this. But I think for me, this is important, that if I look at economic indicators, I think Germany has been a lead in looking at decoupling economic indicator from GDP. So I could still have growth in my economy, but I don't have to have growth in my electricity bill. For me, this is what that means. It means that we need to redefine our indicators, and GDP may not be the right indicator. We talked about localizing water and food security. One thing, because of lack of time, we didn't talk about. There was discussion about regional integration. I think this is very, very important. That regional integration concept is very important as a way forward in terms of water and food security for building more resilient communities. Potential and impact of no water has been discussed, which is needed for bridging the water gap. We need accounting for, modeling, mapping, data, uncertainty in soil and water processes. It's very critical as we move forward in the domain of water and food security. We heard that Nexus and SDGs needs to be brought to the human level. I think this is very important for all of us, and a reminder that we could put any target we want. Unless we can localize it and make a local impact, it's very difficult to make a global impact. I do believe that there was a discussion that we've heard, and in many of the presentations, that the energy sector is critical for the Nexus momentum, especially the renewables. This is very important. Many of us are interested in developing communities, and this is very important because it decentralizes the energy grid. It allows those who may not have access to the energy grid to have access. And SDGs, one of the critical areas is access. Access to water, access to services, to energy, and to food. So the energy, especially the renewable, may have a huge impact and huge role in this area. Last but not least is the role of diplomacy in the Nexus implementation, and this could not be ignored. Thank you very much. I appreciate your patience, and thank you.